Hi, friends. This is Emily. I'm the founder of Friendly City Books, and you're listening to the Friendly City Books podcast. Today, I'm really excited to have author Maggie Hagerman join us to talk about her new book, Children of a Troubled Time. Hi, Maggie.
Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for joining us. So, I am really excited about this conversation because Maggie is actually a professor at Mississippi State University, which is so close to us. It's 30 minutes away. And I knew about her previous book. Before I ever thought about opening a bookstore, she had a book called White Kids that was like all over the national news. And this was it came out in 2018, I think. Is that right? Yeah. So when I found out that she was based in Starkville and had a new book coming out, I was so excited. And so this is Children of a Troubled Time, Growing Up with Racism in Trump's America. It just came out from NYU Press. So congratulations, Maggie.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. So, and to give you the official bio, Margaret Hagerman is Associate Professor of Sociology and Faculty Affiliate in African American Studies and Gender Studies at Mississippi State University. Her previous book, White Kids, won the William J. Good Book Award from the American Sociological Association Family Section. And so I actually wanted to ask you, for those of us who are not professional sociologists and we're not in academia, could you describe what makes sociology different from psychology and political science and other social sciences?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly one that my students at Mississippi State ask me a lot. So I think one important part of sociology is that we're really thinking about how patterns in our society interrelate with one another. So how things that are going on in the economy are shaping things that are happening in our education system, which are, shaping things in our families. And so I think, questioning a lot of taken for granted assumptions about how our society works is part of having a sociological imagination, which would be the way we would kind of talk about it in sociology. And so I think, really understanding how social forces and social institutions at the big macro level impact our lives at the individual level, that's really, to me, what sociology is all about, understanding those interconnections. And that's totally different than psychology, which is more focused on, what's going on at the individual level in our own psyches. Although I do think there's, some interesting sort of in-between ground. Often I think we talk about that as social psychology, where we're bringing together some of these social forces and then also things that are happening for people at the psychological level. So it's really hard, I think, to specify, which social science is which, but I think that I'm really interested in how they connect too, I guess.
Yeah, well, and one reason why I wanted to start the conversation with that question is because the research that you're doing is very unique. And you are making arguments with a sociological approach to them that have not necessarily been made in that way before. And so for those who aren't in the ivory tower of academia, they may not realize what you are doing with these books has not necessarily been done before. And so I like, it's a shout out,
Thanks.
for the, yeah, because, if you're not in the profession, you may not realize this is pretty cool stuff coming out of Mississippi State. I just want to brag on us for that.
Well, I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, so much of what we know about the way that children think about the world comes out of child development. It comes out of developmental psychology. And, I, of course, really respect and appreciate those fields and the work that comes out of there. And certainly some of mine builds on findings from psychologists. There's also more to consider. For example, in this new book, I think about politics and the role that the political realm plays in shaping the way that kids are thinking about the social world. So that's not necessarily a question that would come out of developmental psychology, but it is a question that would come out of sociology. So I'm trying to sort of bring together the importance of understanding children's thinking and development, but also doing that with a larger scope and thinking about the society in which they're coming of age.
Yeah. And so as a political science major myself, I don't think we ever consider the impact of the political environment on children. If we ever did in my academic life or in my practice, in my career in politics, it was more how a policy might impact a child on the, like as in, like how a welfare policy, like how, like access to food, or how education policy and like improving education might impact a child. But what you are doing with this book is thinking about how it impacts children's emotional lives and their sense of belonging and their sense of self. Like that never in a political science environment. So I thought that was really interesting to look at the book in this way. And this also leads me to my other big question for you, just to lay the groundwork for this conversation. Why children? What is it about kids that has gotten you interested in understanding children's sociology with the sociological imagination?
Yeah, so I think children just in general are very interesting to talk to and listen to. I find it like really fun to talk to kids, sort of hear how they're interpreting things around them. But my interest in children from an intellectual perspective is much more about my interest in understanding racism and how racism works in our society. And while, of course, we have a lot of information about the structural level in terms of policies and institutions and history itself, and how those things have shaped racism and continue to perpetuate racism today, we don't know a lot about how the ideas that uphold all of that are transmitted from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. And that's where kids come in, right? We have to understand, I think, how the newest members of society are learning about how race works, in so far as how they're reproducing things that maybe we don't like in our society, but also maybe how they're challenging things and reworking race in different ways. And so this gets really to this area of research called racial socialization or racial learning, and how it is that young kids are producing ideas about racial inequality, privilege, racism, and how they are making sense of all of this in our society, which is, can sometimes be very complicated, especially for younger people. I mean, even for older people, it can be complicated. But for young kids who are being told that they're growing up in a society that's fair and equal, and then they look around and they notice these patterns that don't seem to conform to that, then they're confused. So I'm really curious in how that all works. So yes, I think talking to kids is super interesting and fun, and I genuinely enjoy it. I'm also just really curious about the social reproduction of inequality. Like, how do we continue to have inequality and ideas that support inequality over time, throughout generations and over time.
Yeah. Well, okay. And so you mentioned like race, and understanding race is kind of like the animating factor behind talking to kids. And one thing that really stood out to me about this book is, so first, your approach, you interviewed kids from two different states, Mississippi and Massachusetts, which we expect to be very politically different. So there's geographic differences in the kids that you talk to. There's gender differences because both boys and girls are interviewed through this. There's some age differences. I mean, they're all from the same age range, but you've got some kids who might be as young as maybe like 8, 9, some kids who might be more like 13. And then there are racial differences in the kids that you interviewed. But the racial differences were the most defining characteristic for these kids. That was one of the takeaways I got. So can you talk a little bit more about, just what you were seeing and how kids understood themselves within these groups?
Yeah. So, in my previous research, I only spoke with white children and spent time with white kids because I was trying to understand how white children are interpreting race. But in this project, I was sort of moving out from that work and thinking more about how politics in general is shaping kids' racial learning. And so I wanted to include children across different racial groups in this project. And so I wasn't looking necessarily for racial differences. I was just sort of interviewing a bunch of kids and seeing, making sure that I had kids from different racial groups, and then seeing what kind of patterns emerge. And the pattern that emerged was really about their emotions. And so, those emotions, I argue, are racialized emotions. So yes, the kids had different ideas and different emotions, in ways that were connected to their own racial identity. But I wasn't necessarily going into it assuming that that would happen. And so what I found was that I had three groups of children that emerged from the study. There were white children who were absolutely shocked that Donald Trump was elected to the office of president, and they didn't realize that racism was such a problem in America. That was one of the quotes that one of the children said. And they were really surprised because their entire lives they had been taught that, we have social progress, like racial progress. Racism is in the past. And so, a very colorblind approach. And so for this group of white kids, the emotions they were expressing were shock and anger and disgust and just sort of trying to figure out how they could live in this country that they thought was beyond race and beyond racism, electing somebody that, whatever you think about Donald Trump, you can't deny the explicit racist statements that he had made at that time and has continued to make. And so anyway, that was the first group. The second group of children were white children who really were happy that Trump was elected, and they were celebratory and gleeful, and told me how they would make lots of jokes about building a wall. And, they were very much, they were happy. That is the easiest way to put it. But they really felt like that they felt secure, and they were joyful that he was elected. The third group of kids were the children of color. And I use that phrase children of color purposefully because, while I think it's important to understand, differences between Black kids and Latinx kids, thinking about ethnic differences, and certainly because I did interviews in Mississippi and Massachusetts, the people of color occupy different groups for lots of complicated sociological reasons. So I didn't want to necessarily try to compare Black children in Mississippi to, Cape Verdean immigrant children in Massachusetts. Like, that just didn't really make sense to me. And so I generally kind of looked at these kids together, and they were horrified. I mean, many of them expressed fear. They expressed real feelings of not belonging in this country. They were very scared. It was a lot of that. So I really tried to use the emotions to sort kids into these groups. And then once I did that, it became very clear to me that these emotions are not individual level emotions. These are emotions that are tied to how people experience the world as a result of their racial identity, like how they are perceived by others, how they identify. So this is getting into a concept that is about racialized emotions, that these emotions are about their placement in this hierarchy and their experiences, as a result.
Yeah. And one thing that really stood out to me is that the racialization is also a result of perceived race and how that is linked to social status.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you write about how kids who were Latinx who were legal, immigrants born in the United States, like American citizens, but were perceived to not be American citizens because of their race. And so it didn't actually matter what their citizenship status was because race was the primary factor.
Yeah. And, one of the things I did for this research is I literally found every possible study that I could that had looked at the impact of the Trump presidency, kind of in the way that you were mentioning earlier in terms of his actual policies, how did these policies impact children? And I gathered together in one of the chapters, like everything I could find. And a lot of this research is focused on children of color, broadly speaking. A lot of the work does focus on Latinx kids because of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that was on full display during the Trump administration, as well as a lot of the attention that was put on like family separation policies and how that impacted young kids, and so the fear was really the existing research beyond just what I did really documents that is accurate, that you had children whose families had lived in the United States for a long time, and yet they felt like they were going to be deported, for example. There were even children African American children who believed that they would be, quote, sent back to Africa if Donald Trump was president. These were children who, they were, I think, seeing themselves connected to their Latinx peers and thinking that like there's this threat to all of us. And again, this is not just from my research. These are findings that actually are replicated by public health researchers, education researchers, child development scholars. So it's really concerning ultimately. But I just want to emphasize that this isn't just me that's sort of noticing this.
Yeah, there was actually one researcher that you quoted, and sorry, I'm moving my microphone so I can read the quote that I typed out from the book. So it was Jonathan Mercer who said, group members share, validate, and police each other's feelings. And these feelings structure relationships within and between groups. And that was like a really important, like foundational, just like concept that I, got out of this. And then at another point, he also continued, I think this is his quote as well, that in a racialized society, emotional norms are constantly reinforced by the practices, beliefs, and mutual monitoring of a collective. And I was like, wow, yeah, like we do that, don't we? Like that is how like these social systems are created and endure. And then you also reference another sociologist, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who does have a background as he's Latinx, and described that he felt race before he knew what race was. Like that's kind of paraphrasing one of his quotes. And so reading this book helped me understand, wow, like I as someone who worked in politics, our political beliefs and ideologies form way before we realize that, are forming this early in childhood. And it's not because kids say taxes should be higher or taxes should be lower. It's because they can feel emotions based on these issues that we think are above their heads, but they're not. Yeah. Like kids are smarter than we think.
Yes, they really, really are. I mean, every single child that I spoke to in this study had things to say about politics. Certainly some were more, watching the news and kind of keeping, track of things, and some weren't doing that so much, but they all had opinions. And one of the things I often am asked is like, oh yeah, of course, they're just like reproducing whatever their parents say, like their parents are telling them what to think. And what I find in the study is like, and some of my previous work and then some work I'm doing now is that while parents shape so much of kids' lives, right? They shape where they live, they shape where they go to school, they shape the kind of media that they consume. That they don't determine things, right? And so I've actually experienced a lot of kids who disagree with their parents and who don't think the same way as their parents. And so I just bring that up to say that I think in general, we don't take kids as political participants seriously enough, like whether it be recognizing that they're thinking about this stuff or even giving them credit for coming up with some of their own ideas about things, or at least hearing different ideas from different sources and then trying to piece them together in a way that makes sense for them. So yeah, I definitely think we need to give kids more credit. That's kind of one of the big points of this book. So I'm glad that you brought it up.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. And then there's something in the book where you talk about when adults experience anxiety about politics, one of the coping mechanisms they turn to is to seek out information and just try to learn. And so, of course, we see this with like people kind of getting addicted to Facebook or, people who are just like living on the news cycle and just have the news on TV all day long. What do children do?
Well, I can't make any big, broad claims about what children do, but certainly we know that social media in particular, TikTok is one thing that there's been more research on, plays a role for many kids. It depends on their age, of course. Like some of the kids in this work are a little bit young, weren't quite getting involved with that. But there were kids that actually told me they didn't want to look at it, that it was too overwhelming to even go on to Twitter at that point, or, looking at different Instagram, Snapchat, I think it was one that was very popular, but they didn't even want to go on there. Some of them, one child in particular, because it was too overwhelming and too stressful. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I can make any general claims about kids, overall, but I think what I observed were children trying to figure out how to cope with this very stressful situation, particularly children of color who were feeling like they were being targeted at school, they were being harassed, they were the victims of racist acts by their white peers. So for them, trying to figure out how to manage this moment was very difficult for them. I do think there's a need for more research about the impact of kids in media. I think folks are trying to do that work. I think it's difficult in many ways. Certainly one of the things that I've encountered as I've traveled across the country talking about my previous book, White Kids, was that, school administrators even struggle with this, particularly with the apps where the kids can take a picture, and Snapchat is what I'm talking about, but, they take a picture and then it disappears within a few moments after people look at it. So what do you do when a kid sends a racist image to like the entire school through Snapchat? How do you then deal with that as a school administrator? Right? These are the kinds of issues that I think adults are faced with in figuring out how to help children navigate these tools and this technology, but then also, I don't know, like, I don't know. I feel very mixed about it, right? There's like some good things to it, and there's some things that I think are very troubling.
Yeah. Well, and I do wonder about like the application and like, for someone who is, for example, like a school administrator, you mentioned the family separation that happened in Mississippi, like in our state, when there was an ICE raid at a chicken processing plant. And so there are kids who were separated from their parents that day, and kids who maybe did not lose their parents that day, but felt that they could be in the same boat, like that could come on another day. And I do wonder if you are their teacher or if you are an administrator at their school. This is probably a different area of research, but that I would have to imagine that impacts their behavior and their academic achievement if they're sitting in the school desk wondering, are my parents going to be there when I get home?
Absolutely. My colleague here at Mississippi State in the sociology department, Dr. Diego Thompson, has done some really important research actually in Mississippi on this exact topic. And I have talked to him about all of this. And yeah, I mean, the thing about that particular raid too is it happened on the first day of school, right? So like there's something about that too, that when you think about what the first day of school symbolizes and what that means for families, you can see how a kid would be very traumatized by that. So I haven't studied that specific raid, but Dr. Thompson's work is really important. And if anyone's interested that's listening, I would encourage you to check out some of the stuff that he's written about it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I mean, since I did bring up like the Mississippi of it, I mean, I do always like to turn our podcast conversations to like what this means for us as Mississippians. And so in the research you did, there's two groups, kids from Mississippi and kids from Massachusetts. And there's one thing that one of the participants from Mississippi said, and if you don't mind, I'd just like to like read her entire quote. This is Zena, who is described as a 12-year-old white girl from Mississippi. So this is just kind of like her stream of consciousness response in her interview. I mean, Mississippi is racist. It's a racist state. If you say like something about Mississippi to someone, one of the first things that comes into their mind about Mississippi is racism. You can kind of see the look in people's eyes when you're like, oh yeah, I'm from Mississippi. They're just like, oh, how's that working out for you? I think Mississippi is, I wouldn't say stuck in their ways, but kind of. I don't know the word I'm looking for. I guess they're a little slower to change and kind of like slower to like accepting people. I've actually come up with a slogan, Mississippi, racism and unforgiving religious views. That was just like, kind of blew my mind to read that these were the like real thoughts of a 12-year-old girl here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, there's a lot of conversations that I'm sure you've had and listened to about, young people leaving the state of Mississippi, for example, once they, get their education or, I don't study that, but clearly there was some of that came through with some of these interviews with these children who felt like Mississippi just wasn't a place where they wanted to live. Certainly that it was not the case for all of the children, but that quote also struck me, that entire interview struck me. And I think it also demonstrates that I was trying to push back, I think, with this in this book that like, oh, all of these like, people that, like the Mississippi people are like this and Massachusetts people are like that. And I think what Zena's quote shows, and especially alongside a lot of the other white kids, is the range of ideas in both places amongst white children about politics, race, where they live. But yeah, I think what you're getting at is more about Mississippi, and a lot of the children mentioned racism as a problem here. I will say though, as the person doing the research and collecting all the data, racism is not something that Mississippi has, to focus on itself only, right? Like, I actually argue in the book that racism is a national project, and I didn't really find any differences in terms of the substance of what kids said about racism and politics across these two regions. I thought I would, honestly. I thought I would find a little bit more variation between the kids in Mississippi and Massachusetts, but I just didn't. There were some differences in terms of like what they knew about. So, for example, kids in Massachusetts had no idea about debates around the Confederate flag or the Mississippi state flag at the time that I was doing this research. There's a lot of discussion around that and debate about that. And so, or even Confederate monuments, like the kids in the Northeast had no idea what any of that meant, whereas the children in Mississippi were much more opinionated, whatever their opinions were. And then similarly, the kids in Massachusetts at this time were much more familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement. There were signs that people were putting in their, yards, and there was just more attention to that movement there. Hardly any of the kids in Mississippi during the time period of 2017 to 2019, when I interviewed kids, really knew even what that meant or, had any sense of it. So there were like differences, I think, that have to do with where kids are growing up, these contextual differences. But in terms of their actual expressions of racism or their opinions about politics, I really saw it across the board. So I think that's good for understanding that we can't just like put Mississippi as like, oh, all the racism in America can get dumped onto Mississippi, right? Like, I mean, there's clearly problems in Mississippi, don't get me wrong. But I think that these problems, especially when it comes to racism, are like I said, a national project.
Yeah, I have misquoted Malcolm X a million times on this podcast, but, he said like everything south of Canada is Mississippi, like something to that effect. And I just, that's always in the back of my mind. But there are two like specific things from your research and from the book that I do wonder, like, did you see Mississippi, Massachusetts difference or did you not? So the first one I wanted to raise is in the book, you said, every single white child I have ever interviewed about racism prior to this study told me that racism is bad. And they went to great lengths to distance themselves from accusations of being called racist. Did that change?
Yes. From the data that I have. Again, one of the things about doing these interview studies is you can't make any big, broad generalizations about the entire population or anything like that. That's not my objective. My objective is to understand how kids are thinking and feeling. But yes, when I wrote the book White Kids, those children all, even the ones that, could consider themselves to be maybe more in line with like a Trump kind of supporting child in this new project. They told me that racism was bad. Every single kid, racism is bad. I don't want to be racist. I don't want you to think I'm racist. Many of them articulated the idea that racism is something from the past. They talked about like Dr. King and how like after he came around that everything got good, everything was gone, all the racism was gone. So they were not necessarily, I think, reflecting an accurate sense of the realities of racism in America, but they believed it was bad. And in this new study, I found that there were a group of kids who were like, racism is fine. That's literally one of the quotes from one of the girls was, racism is fine. I don't care. Like, yeah, Trump is racist, but that's not really my concern. I don't care about that. And so to me, that's a difference, right? And I want to be cautious that we're not like, oh, kids now are so racist. I think that the kids that were saying that racism is over when, the civil rights movement happened, those kids are also reinforcing racist ideas, right? This colorblind racism of like, let's pretend like racism doesn't exist, right? That's also bad. But there's something about saying that racism is okay that to me just feels different. So I guess, and I really talk about the sort of new white nationalism that I think the Trump era ushered in. Other scholars have written about this, and this idea that It's okay to be upfront and honest about people's, ideas that, the country should be white, for example. And so I saw that coming across with some of the kids in this new book. So again, I think colorblind racism is a problem and leads to a lot of, like our structural level problems, and our inability to solve a lot of this stuff is because people don't want to confront race honestly and racism honestly. But I also think that this new white nationalism is bad, right? So I think they're both bad, but I think that I didn't see so much of the new white nationalism in the first study. So that might be a bit convoluted.
No, yeah, no. I mean, that's fascinating, interesting, concerning. Like,
Yeah.
there are a lot of ways you could react to that. But that actually, so the other thing I was going to ask you about is, um, white kids, saying that their grandparents are explicitly racist. And I think so. That probably feeds into the idea that people used to be racist, but people are less racist now. But what you were just telling me kind of shows that there that perception is changing if we are saying that like racism is not a deal breaker anymore.
Yeah. It's funny. So many of my students over the years have been like, when all the old people just die off, then like we won't have racism anymore. And it's like that. First of all, there's a number of problems with that statement. And certainly I think that during the Obama era and even before that, I think there was this sort of idea that we live in a colorblind society, right? And so we don't need to do anything about racial inequality, because racial inequality, if there is any inequality, it's not because things are set up unfairly. It's because people have made bad decisions, quote unquote, or, people haven't worked hard enough or something like that. And so, this erasure of any reality of racism that was happening sort of in the post-civil rights era, generally speaking, that's still with us today. But I do feel like this, I don't know, there's something about children looking you in the eye and saying that they don't care about racism that just, I don't know, that just gets to me at a different level. My colleague, Cynthia Miller Idris, she writes about the far right, which that's not my area of research, but she talks about how more and more Americans are moving towards the periphery of the far right. And it's because of the way that these ideas are being mainstreamed. And one of the ways that they're mainstreamed is through a lot of like youth related thing, like youth culture, whether that be on social media or whether that be on college campuses or whether that be through some of these different, she talks about like martial arts and all kinds of things. You can check out her book, Hate in the Homeland is her most recent book. But anyway, I read her work and I think about my work, and I do think there's reason to be very concerned. I think there's reason to be concerned when children, like some of the ones in this book, say to me, I think we should drop an atomic bomb on an entire part of the world to solve our problems, right? That to me, that's just, to hear that from a 12-year-old is very concerning. So I guess one of the things I'm trying to do in this work is understand, like, where are these ideas coming from? How are kids thinking about this? And yeah, I'm just struck by the fact that in my first book, kids some of them didn't even want to talk to me about race because they didn't want me to think they were racist. Like, it was like hard to even get them to open up about it. Not this time. It was a completely different situation.
Well, okay. And so, talking about that idea, like, oh, once a certain generation is gone, we won't be racist anymore, and how that ignores like the fact that there is a structure created to perpetuate it when generations turn over. It seems to me that like one argument you can make is that the system exists because we have emotions about social status, and the system is created to reinforce who's on top. And you talk about, there are three emotions in particular that stood out to me in this book: fear, anger, and pleasure. Do you think one of those emotions is more important than the others in kind of like creating these systems and this like the practices and the mutual monitoring that we were talking about, like validation and policing? Or do all of those emotions contribute? Do they are they part and parcel, like hand in hand, or can you identify this specific emotion drives a specific behavior or belief?
Yeah, that's a really amazing question, Emily, and a very complicated one. I think,
Sorry.
no, I think it's a great question. I think that based on what I know from my research and from reading a lot of, what other scholars have written about, I think fear is probably what's undergirding a lot of this, right? I think, for example, the children who were very pro-Trump, the white children, they started off by talking about the games they played at recess, the racist jokes they told each other, the way that they were expressing what I talk about as like the emotions of dominance, right? How they were getting pleasure out of feeling powerful, and they were learning about what that means when they were young, when they were, in middle school. But those kids would say to me, like, I don't care about racism. And then they would tell me all these things and about jokes and games. And then they would start to go into how, it's not just that we play this game about the wall at recess, it's that we actually need a wall. And here's why. And then this whole, like, launching into this whole explanation of why they thought that, their ideas about immigration reform, essentially. And so I sort of found that these kids were preoccupied by a lot of the things they said they didn't care about, right? They were preoccupied with thinking about this perceived threat to their own status that would come from undocumented immigrants or Black people or Muslim people, or in some cases people who weren't Christian like them, right? So there was a lot of there was just a lot of fear that I saw from that group, which is different than the fear that I noticed with the children of color who were like, I'm scared that I might get shot by the police, or I'm scared that, I'm going to get deported and my family's going to get deported. Those are different types of fear. But I do think that a lot of the ideas about race and a lot of the emotions connected to race in this country are connected to different kinds of fear. And I think we see other emotions that come along with it. But certainly, I think that if I had to answer your question, I would say that there's this classic theory in sociology by this guy named Herbert Bloomer about, the fear of the sort of this group threat, this idea that you're a member of a group, you occupy a position in society, and you want to maintain power. And so if you perceive a threat to your group, then you're going to act in a certain way to sort of protect and maintain your sense of group position. So that's getting a little, theoretical. But this idea that social groups are organized in a hierarchy. There's different amounts of power, and people want to maintain power. I mean, that's the essential argument here. And so, I guess I'm trying to show in this book that I think that some of these white children are, even if they say they don't care about all of this, they are trying to figure out how to maintain a sense of dominance and and how to feel powerful in the midst of what they perceive, whether or not these threats are real, they perceive to be threats to that group position. So that's my answer. I don't know.
No, I mean,
one, but
that totally answers the initial question I have, but it leads me to another bigger question that cannot be answered very easily. And that's, what do we do about it?
Yeah. Yeah. So I get asked this question all the time by people like, okay, what do we do? What do we do? And so I did actually in this book, unlike the previous book, put a chapter at the end where I list some concrete ideas that I have. A lot of these ideas I think are sort of targeted at educators or parents, people that interact with kids. This book obviously is an academic book, but I did try to write it in a way that would be, accessible and of interest, really, to people who are outside of academic sociology. So some of those ideas are pretty basic in a way, like thinking sociologically about how children learn about race. If we don't understand that kids are developing these ideas in childhood as a result of the school they attend, the neighborhood they live in, their peers, their media, their teachers, their extracurricular activities, the political landscape of their childhoods, right? If we don't take that seriously, we're never going to be able to start to address some of this stuff. And so one of my big pushes is for us to think more sociologically about the way that kids learn about race, kids across racial groups, so that we can figure out ways to help them prepare to live in the reality of a multiracial democracy. This is what we have. And so I think that we don't help anybody by not preparing them to live in that world. I also think that the realities of the political realm need to be taken seriously as factors in children's lives, so understanding that kids are going to access different ideas online, some of which might be very violent and dehumanizing and contribute to in the development of ideas that are antithetical to a multiracial democracy, then, if we can recognize that, then we can start to think about some of the kinds of training programs, for example, around like media literacy, like helping kids understand, how to interpret what they're coming across in media, and how to trust, what's true, what's not true. There's a lot there. I also talk a lot about the importance of challenging the white nationalist ideas, but also challenging the colorblind ideas. I think you could read this book and think, oh, we need to focus on, the ways that these, pro-Trump kids are, leading us down this certain path. Yes, that is important. But what's so fascinating about a lot of the white kids I interviewed who did not like Trump was that they said to me, once Trump is out of office, everything will go back to normal. And that doesn't address racial inequality, right? I mean, it's not like before Trump came along, we didn't have any racial inequality. And so that's, to me, like the pernicious nature of colorblind thinking, is that it doesn't allow people to actually create change in ways that can lead, if you care about the goal of racial equity, which, I certainly do. So there's a lot more. There are other suggestions that I give in the back in that last chapter as well. But I would say the biggest takeaway for me is listening to kids and taking them seriously. I guess I'll just add one quick thing. Parents often ask me, like, what did my kids say? And I'm like, how do you not know? Like, I guess like there's some curiosity of like, what does my kids say to this random strange sociology lady, right? But like, I also get the sense that parents don't know a lot of this stuff. They don't know that their kids are thinking in these ways. And so, some of my newer research is actually talking to college age kids about disagreements with their parents. And I'm learning a lot about what parents know about their kids, what parents don't know about their kids. And so I don't know, I guess another big takeaway is just that I think we collectively need to take kids seriously. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually think about that a lot in my role as the owner of a bookstore, and book access, and with the rise of books being banned.
Yeah.
I always have to wonder if there is a parent-child conflict over a book that a child has selected. There's
Yeah.
something deeper going on. And I am not, I shouldn't be in the place of being in the referee in that situation,
Yeah.
because the parent needs to have a conversation with the child that I'm not in the position to have. But the child is clearly, maybe seeking out information or how to understand or make sense of something that is important to them, or maybe bothering them, or like maybe putting them in a really difficult mental position, or like mental health position. And yeah, it does go to show that like yeah, parents do need to talk to their kids before that bridge is broken.
Yeah. And since you brought it up, I think the reality is, at the very end of this book, I looked at some of the most recent, when this book went to press, research about the political conflict that's happening in schools around things like what books should kids have access to. And these scholars from UCLA and UC Riverside found. They have this report called "Educating for a Diverse Democracy," and they write, they document how political conflicts have, quote, created a broad chilling effect in schools that have limited opportunities for students to practice respectful dialogue, and make it harder to address rampant misinformation. And so, when we have this chilling effect happening in school, it's not like kids don't still have questions, right? Like they might not be learning about racism or racial diversity or even other issues related to gender identity or what, there's a host of things we could talk about. But I guess for me, when I talk to parents about this stuff, I'm like, well, they're going to get answers to those questions somewhere, somehow. Like children have agency, children are resourceful. Like think about sex ed, for example, right? Like kids get information about things they want to know about, even if their parents aren't the ones to provide them. But my question is always like, well, wouldn't you want to be involved? Like, wouldn't you want to be the mediator here? And I think parents also feel a lot of fear around this stuff, and they really want their children to think in certain ways. And when their children ask questions that makes them scared that, that they need to control their kid or something, I don't know. It's part of my new research, so I can report back to you what I find. But I think
Yeah.
your role as a bookstore owner, and you have an amazing selection of children's books. I have a toddler, and we actually came in and we're trying to not tear apart your entire store, but looking at a lot of the books, and you have some great ones. And I think that's so important. We know that these books matter so much for how children learn about all aspects of the social world, not just about race and the kinds of things we've been talking about today. But we have a book that we bought about the climate and about the earth and about more of like a physical science type of thing. That's important. So anyway, I appreciate the work that you're doing is what I'm trying to say.
Well, thank you. But yeah, it does get to, these bigger questions of like how to access information and those points of access being cut off.
Yeah.
And it goes back to, the systems that we have created to protect social status and race being used as a proxy for that social status. And it's all related, isn't it? So
Yes, it is all related. But I think this whole discussion about books and kids, like, this is why we have to think seriously about the impact of politics on childhood. I mean, I don't think you know more about politics than me, but like, I don't think politicians necessarily are all that worried about kids and children's well-being. I think if they were, we'd see a whole host of different kinds of policies on the books. I think they're interested in advancing certain agendas and getting elected. And so they're using these things like debates around what kind of books children should access to garner support from different groups. And so I don't like that for many reasons, but especially because it doesn't take kids seriously, right? Kids are the ones that have to then live with the consequences of these policies. And whatever type of policies you're talking about, like, I don't know. I think we should take kids more seriously.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing this. When the third book comes out, let us know because we'll be excited to talk about, this new research that you're doing too. But so Maggie's newest book is Children of a Troubled Time. It came out a few weeks ago from NYU Press, and you can get it at Friendly City Books or your local bookstore. And I'm sure this is going to be talked about in the news for a lot this year. Hopefully this year is, I don't know. I'm not ready, but we'll see.
Yes. Well, I thank you so much for reading it and for helping, to think me to think through it. It's always fun to hear what other people take out of, something that you've written. So I appreciate this conversation so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And we look forward to doing more. We're so excited to be able to spotlight a local professor who is doing really unique and interesting research. So thank you for coming to us, and thanks for being on the show. And for those of you who are listening, thanks for listening, and happy reading.